Thank you. I also like to welcome the people who are joining us on Crowdcast. I think we are finally on now. Thank you for hanging in there with us, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'd like to welcome our panelists, welcome our guests. Thank you so much for saying yes. Thank you to PEN America for asking us to partner with you to mark National Banned Book Week. Is it International Banned Book Week? I think it's international because the United Nations also mark. Okay, so then International Banned Books Week. So I am going to, so this is how the evening is going to proceed. I am going to invite Diona Kelly Said, who is the regional representative for PEN America, who approached Rufua and kind of enabled us to put all of this together. And so I'm going to allow her to say a few words to kind of open the occasion for us. And then I'm going to come back up here and introduce Danielle, who's our moderator, after which she will then introduce our panelists, and we will then proceed on to the conversation, which should be about 45 minutes, and we will take questions for about 15 to 30 minutes, both online and questions from our audience here. If we have time, we'll take questions online, but I'm hoping we can, maintain a healthy balance. So, Diona, if you would like to say a few words.
Should I come there?
Yes, please.
Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome. I don't know about you, but for the past year, I've been living in a really small world. Like, really, really small. So it feels really good to be able to drive somewhere, like from Greensboro, North Carolina, and to come here to Durham. But also walking into the space, and this is the first time I've been here, it's like there's this global feeling here, and it's like, oh, so beautiful. And one thing, as working with PEN over the past 2 years, I've been able to make my world so much bigger. Because I believe strongly in PEN's mission that writers and journalists and creatives are what keeps democracy in check. We are what makes our communities vibrant, and it's been an honor to represent PEN in the North Carolina Piedmont. And some of the programming that we've done has highlighted the importance of independent journalism. We know we're at a moment where journalism is under threat, and PEN fights to advocate for journalistic freedom and freedom of expression and the rights of journalists. The other thing that's important to me is highlighting what makes our literary community so special, what makes our creative community so special. And that's voices of all types, because when you live in a small world, your aperture becomes too small, and small stories become a liability for every one of us, especially right now in this country. We can't rely on small stories anymore. I think small stories are actually dangerous and a threat to our democracy. And that's why I'm so honored to advocate for PEN, to represent PEN here in North Carolina, and to also be here tonight to hear this conversation. PEN does lots of programming throughout the country through its chapters. Here in North Carolina, we have focused panels with journalists. We've done literary panels at literary festivals. We've also had community building panels, like an event right before COVID at the PEN Hook in Durham called Literary Frivolity, where we just had a lot of fun and told stories. I am so happy to be here tonight and to see you. There is a table back there that has some information about PEN. Please learn more about PEN. Please consider joining PEN and supporting this. And I was asked to make an announcement tonight. PEN America is preparing a comprehensive report on the pressing issue of legislative bans being introduced across the country on curriculum and discussions on the issue of diversity and equality, sometimes put under the banner of critical race theory, though that term is often misapplied. That report will be out within the next month and will lay out a comprehensive analysis and set of recommendations from the PEN America perspective.
Thank you, Diona. So when Diona first kind of approached us with the idea for this event, and then introduced me to William Dodson, who is director at PEN Program, I remember in our initial conversation, the first thing that came to my mind was how much, this kind of conversation around critical race theory is often just about misunderstanding. People who really have no real sense of critical race theory as a scholarly tradition, as a concept, as a term, what does it mean? And so when I was thinking about who I might invite on the panel, I thought of Dr. Jennifer Nash's work around Black feminism in the university, and this question that she raises around defensiveness and the unproductiveness of defensiveness when we could, in fact, be thinking further and kind of thinking in more nuanced ways. And so that was the intention behind convening these particular people. I was interested in what Dr. Blair Kelly might say from a historical perspective, how she could perhaps remind us of other traditions of Black thinking, of Black organizing, our modes of resistance that even as the headlines convince us that there is something about critical race theory that is just so unique and so radical, there have been moments where we have been more radical. There have been moments where we have been conservative. So how do we think about critical race theory in context? And so I have heard Danielle ask really critical conversations. I remember watching her moderating, I think, a panel, I can't remember, I think it was at a university in New York, and thinking this would be the person that we might invite to moderate this conversation. So there was a lot of thought in this, which is a critical race theory scholar. So that was the kind of thinking behind convening this panel in the way that we eventually did, Bev and I. And so without taking up any more time, let me introduce Danielle Purifoy, who is currently assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She holds a PhD in environmental politics and African American studies from Duke University. She also earned a BA in English and political science from Vassar College and a JD from Harvard Law School. Her current research traces the roots of contemporary environmental conditions in the United States and U.S. South, specifically in Black towns dating back to the post-Vietnam era. She's written about the legal dimensions of environmental justice and equity in food systems. She is the former race and place editor at Scalawag, a magazine devoted to Southern politics and culture. And she's also the current board chair at North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. So thank you so much for being with us.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. People definitely can't hear me with this mask on, so I'm going to keep it off while I'm speaking and put it on when I'm not. Thank you so much to Narrated, to Bev, to Diona, to PEN America for organizing this event during International Banned Books Week, and to Dr. Kelly and Dr. Nash for being here today. I am going to do the introductions for Dr. Kelly and Dr. Nash, and then I'm going to set some context for our discussion today, and we're going to launch right in. Okay, so Dr. And it just so happens that we are collectively representing, or not representing, we are from, I guess, 3 of the universities in this area, and this is our first time meeting, so it's an event. I also want to say that, I live in East Durham, now in Rofiwa, which only opened in May, right, has like very quickly become like an essential institution in this neighborhood. So I just want to kind of give it up for Rofiwa for this really creating space. So thanks to you all for your hard work, and to everyone watching on the Crowdcast. Okay, so Dr. Blair Kelly is Assistant Dean for Interdisciplinary Studies and International Programs in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and Associate Professor of History at North Carolina State University. Kelly is currently at work on a new book, Black Folk, The Promise of the Black Working Class, for Liverite W.W. Norton and Company, which was awarded a 2020 Creative Nonfiction Grant by the Whiting Foundation. Her first book, Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African American Citizenship, won the Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize for Best Book from the Association of Black Women Historians. Active inside the Academy and out, Kelly has produced and hosted her own podcast and has been a guest on CNN Tonight with Don Lemon, MSNBC's All In, and Melissa Harris Perry's show. The Melissa Harris Perry Show, NPR's Here and Now, and WUNC's The State of Things. She has written for the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Root, The Griot, Ebony, Salon, and Jet magazines. Highlighted as one of the top tweeting historians by the History News Network, which is a feat. Kelly was among the first generation of historians active on Twitter. She has been tweeting as @Prof. BLM Kelly for more than 12 years, and she has over 43,000 followers. Kelly received her BA from the University of Virginia in History and African American Studies. She earned her Master's and PhD in History and graduate certificates in African and African American Studies and Women's Studies at Duke University. Dr. Jennifer Christine Nash is the Jean Fox O'Barr Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard University and her JD at Harvard Law School. She is the author of 3 books, The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, which was awarded the Alan Bray Memorial Book Award by the GLQ Caucus of the Modern Language Association, Black Feminism Reimagined, awarded the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association, and Birthing Black Mothers. She is also the editor of Gender, Love, Macmillan Reference USA 2016. Her research has been supported by the ACLS Burkhardt Residential Fellowships, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation's Career Enhancement Fellowship Program. All right, so let's give it up for our panelists today. Okay, so now some context setting for our discussion today. In July 2020, in the midst of the uprisings over police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and about 6 months after the publication of the 1619 Project in the New York Times, was spearheaded by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who, as you all know, was a subject of much controversy over her 10-year battle at UNC Chapel Hill over the last summer, so you may know her from that. There was a conservative activist and senior fellow from the Manhattan Institute named Chris Rufo, who went on the Tucker Carlson show on Fox News and claimed that he completed 6 months of research about critical race theory. And he claimed that critical race theory, quote, has pervaded every institution in the federal government and has, in essence, become the default ideology of the federal bureaucracy and is now being weaponized against the American people, end quote. And he used 3 examples as his findings for this 6-month study. The first was a diversity training that happened in the Treasury Department. The second was that the FBI had been apparently holding weekly seminars on intersectionality, which is astonishing, actually. And third, that the Sandia National Laboratories, which does research for nuclear power development, that white male executives were forced to a re-education camp on race and to write apology letters to people of color. He claimed that critical race theory is an existential threat to the U.S. and to the federal bureaucracy, even under Donald Trump. And he called for Donald Trump to issue an immediate executive order to ban critical race theory and to, quote, stamp out this destructive, divisive, pseudoscientific ideology at its root, end quote. Months after, in September 2020, Trump issued an executive order banning federal contractors from conducting diversity and racial sensitivity trainings. And various states followed with other bans on diversity trainings in government and education and race in schools. And as of July of this year, over 24 states have some form of legislation that is some form of bill form or passed around similar bans. So that's our context setting. And so I want to start by actually defining our term for this evening. What is critical race theory and where did it come from? And either one of you can answer that question and piggyback off of each other, however you want to start.
I wore the wrong earrings to deal with that, sorry. So one of the things that Danielle and I share is that we were both educated at an institution that's foundational to the story of critical race theory, Harvard Law School. So when I talk to my students about critical race theory, I always start by situating it as a movement that was born in the legal academy, because I think as the term circulates in the context setting that you just did, it's easy to forget that it was intellectual and political project that aspired to think about law fundamentally. And so I think when we begin to think about some of the early folks in the critical race theory movement, whether it's someone like Derek Bell or Charles Lawrence or Kimberly Crenshaw or Mari Matsuda, one of the questions that they were trying to think about is how do we understand the coexistence of decades of laws that were designed presumably to ensure racial equity alongside the persistence of racial inequality. So Derek Bell, for example, famously asked 50 years after Brown versus Board of Education, why is it that we had the promise of desegregated schools and schools are still segregated? Like, how do we understand that coexistence? So it was in part a desire to understand law's failures, and I think also to de-romanticize this idea of progress, this American narrative of progress, right? That the story is once upon a time, Black folks were oppressed and now we're free, right? And Derek Bell wanted to say, actually, no, that's not the story at all. But I think another piece of that critical race theory story is about the university as a space. So Derek Bell famously said that he wasn't going to continue to teach at Harvard Law School until Harvard Law School could find and tenure a woman of color. It took a long time for them to find Lonnie Grenier. She was right there to find her. And Derek Bell had a cohort of students, including Kimberly Crenshaw, who felt very strongly that courses like race, racism, and the law should be taught by faculty of color, and who felt that there was a relationship between the experience and embodied history of the person who teaches and how they teach. So I think, it's a critical race theory is about law, and it's also very much about the university and its politics.
I'm not going to try to follow two Harvard Law graduates about critical race theory, but when I heard for the first time that there were these things afoot about critical race theory, I thought to myself, well, we're all up, we're reading Lonnie Grenier, we're like, we got our Patricia Williams back out, and we're worried about this? Like, these were the scholars that were at the forefront of our thinking when I was in undergraduate a long time ago, and they're phenomenal scholars. They've been impactful on the way that a generation of us have thought. But to really say critical race theory, you're talking about a very particular set of scholars and a particular set of ideas that are powerful and important for thinking about the question of progress and the question of race and law when you can't see race in the law, right? So they help to delineate and to outline its existence, and even in its silences, which I think is important work for so many of us to find us in those silences, right? So historians are thinking about the archive right now and its silences, and so it's really a forerunner for writing against the grain. But it's not taught in elementary school. It's not taught in your average college classroom. It's not a thing that the gentleman who was on Fox News was describing. The things that he was talking about was just the mention of race, the mention of Black history, the mention of a set of ideas about who we are as a country and how we got here. And so I think it's a really strange argument to have, right? We don't want to say, well, I'm not a critical race theorist, so it's okay, because there's a kind of ridiculousness of someone just picking something out and deciding it has a name that isn't that name at all, and then, passing new laws to talk about it. But it speaks to this moment that we're in, where the world we're in is not being described accurately. The world we're in is not really being called to question in the ways that it really should be. And so I think it's quite fitting and an important thing for us to respond. It's an important thing for us as scholars of color, as Black folks, as people who care about truth, as people who care about our history and our many histories, to begin to say, this is not what this is, what this is, and really create our own definition for what we see happening in this particular moment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that I've been sitting with personally in this moment is, and I guess it's a bit more context setting for this moment that we're in. Is that, you know, critical race theory, even though it was born in law schools and the legal academy, its ideas and concepts as a framework have been used by a lot of other disciplines, right? So I remember when I was in grad school, you know, having learned about it as a legal framework, then learning about it in things like sociology, right, and the social sciences, and really thinking about how, you know, how it contributed to our conversations about structural racism, right? And I think maybe everyone in here, I'm not sure, maybe we could do a show of hands of how many folks have heard someone on the news or in some public forum use the term structural racism. Can we get a show of hands? Yeah, almost everyone in this room. And really, right, I would say that like the sort of lineage, right, of critical race theory from the legal academy to these other disciplines is really responsible for getting structural racism out into the public sphere as something we talk about. And so one of the things that, you know, one of the spaces, right, where we see structural racism talked about, right, is in contemporary Black movement formations, right? So the movement for Black lives, right, which has had various, right, throughout the 2010s, right, and certainly until last year, has been on various waves, right? The language, right, around this is not about these police killings, right, is how many times have you heard, right, it's not just about a bad apple, right? It's not just about an individual cop, right? That it's really about a system, right, of oppression that's manifested through sets of institutions and policies and practices, right, that are racist both in their conceptualization, right, and in their implementation. And so to hear that kind of language, right, like out in the streets, and this is not to at all, right, this is really like not what these folks are talking about, which is so interesting to me. But I will say that like critical race theory from its origins to today has actually gotten out, I think, one of the ways that it has emerged on the public scene, right, is through discussions of structural racism, which is really about getting away from talking about individual level, right, like racism and prejudice, right, and getting into talking about systems and institutions, right, which is what folks who were on the streets last June and July when all of this started were talking about. But wasn't what what's dude's name? Chris Rufo was actually talking about in on Fox News. So I want to kind of circle back to you know, what he was talking about, which was diversity trainings, right? Racial sensitivity trainings, right? What's the implicit bias, right, trainings. And I want to ask y'all to maybe reflect on like, what is there any nexus? This feels like a leading question. Is there any nexus, right, between critical race theory and diversity and inclusion trainings? And like, I kind of want to ask like how you think critical race theorists might think right, about these kinds of trainings, right, and their usefulness, right, in our public sphere?
Well, it's interesting because there's a whole literature critiquing the ways in which we do diversity now, which I think is a really wonderful one. My very good friend, Candace Watt-Smith, wrote a book called Stay Woke, where she sort of unpacks a lot of the terms that are used. And I saw her give a really wonderful presentation about sort of like diversity complex and the degree to which diversity has done the opposite of what you were describing in terms of thinking about structures, and instead really focused on individuals and their process and some journey that they're having in terms of how they feel about themselves and other people around them, and that it's all sort of a very personalized and sort of fractured way of thinking about it. And so that, these spaces can be filled now with better people who think better after they've had training, and a real avoidance and an inability to talk about the way in which our institutions have perpetuated inequalities, have perpetuated the degree to which the rooms in which we teach don't look that different than they did when we started this whole process. One of my favorite things to tell my students so that they have a sense of the passage of time is that my mother could not have attended or taught or worked at any of the institutions where I went to graduate school or where I worked. And so in that one generational space, we've seen a huge difference. So I don't want to mark the world as not having changed, right? So the things that I could do, the rooms that I could walk in were a different set of rooms. But the assumptions that guided those rooms were much the same and have not been as revolutionized as the access has. So that the perpetuation of the perniciousness of our assumptions about the capability of Black and brown folks has not really been transformed. That we could be accepting of a world that would look at a person like a Nicole Hannah-Jones and see something untenurable and awful. And to look at her work and the gatherings of scholars that she's brought together and the conversations that she's spearheaded as anything other than scholarship. That we can continue to make these assumptions about Blackness, that it's not the same, that there is a deficiency and an inferiority that is still baked in to so many assumptions. I think that's what diversity is afraid to do oftentimes in the spaces where I've experienced diversity training. I'm probably not the most trainable person at this point, but when I experience those trainings, it really is, speak up in the room if you hear something wrong. Those kinds of things. Instead of, question why your entire department is never tenured a Black woman before you. That's not the question I'm being called to ask. And so I'm asking that question, and I'm not being seen as a person who is necessarily part of what we do want to see change. It is beginning to change, but I think there's a failure to look at those spaces as also needing systemic change. That good folks who have decent intentions also are part of the structures that are keeping Black women from achieving full professor status and those kinds of things that we've been talking about in the academy. And not to mention this broader world in which we see the failure of society to think more broadly about our health, about our communities, about our safety, about our ability to make a living wage. And so many things it's not undoing and it's not asking questions about.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I think so often the fact of having a training, which our universities all do, is treated as evidence of some kind of institutional change, right? When it's not. It just means that we've all spent 3 hours on this individual journey towards understanding how to be better people, right? And so I think there's this really fascinating way in which the language of diversity becomes this kind of institutional alibi, right? It says like, oh, we've changed because everybody has to spend these 3 hours together. Which is why I think, critical race theory, I think, always has a critique of diversity if what diversity means is get 2 Black people and put them in the system as it was, right? And change nothing about the norms of the system, the logics of the system, the ideas of standards, the ideas of excellence, just insert Blackness, and just a little bit of it, right? Just insert a little bit of Blackness and voila, you have diversity. Critical race theory, if you go back to where you started with Black Lives Matter, I think always has this critique of ideas of reform, right? Like, and to go back to your idea of like, critical race theory thinks of racism as structural, like there's something intrinsic to the way that the world has been built through these small reforms of the equity training, or to go back to Black Lives Matter, body cams, right? Do nothing to change the structural reality of how the world is arranged.
So we're in this moment right now where the consequence of this right-wing panic that is not only based on a falsehood, but is also deeply wrong and disingenuous, has actual real-life consequences for what we can do, what little gains we have had in curriculum, right? Or at least the absence of targeted legislation against, right, modes of actually being able to have discussions about race. And so, the Biden administration, right, so, came in and immediately reversed the executive order, Trump's executive order for the that ban diversity trainings, right, for federal contractors or within the federal government. But we have like 24 states right now, right, that are in these including North Carolina, right, that have introduced bills or passed bills, right, that are targeting these trainings that we're critiquing, like critical race theory actually critiques, right, and, right, banning discussion of race in K through 12 classrooms, sometimes in public universities, right, wherever institutions where our state governments can reach, right, and dictate. So I want to ask, kind of beyond the general consequences of having K through 12 students and some university students get even more misrepresentation, right, about American U.S. history. Because in fact, right, it wasn't just ban this. There's the 1776, right, commission, right, to talk about how America became great, right? That's a co-curriculum. So beyond, right, the kind of harm that was already happening before this happened, right? Of people being misinformed about United States history. What are some of the other outcomes that you're worried about, or you might anticipate from some of these kinds of bans? And maybe you have seen some pushback in your universities. I'm not sure, but I want to hear about other things that maybe we haven't thought about beyond the kind of obvious consequences.
Yeah. So I think the suppression of Black thought generally, right, is part of the answer. Because I think what's so interesting about critical race theory is how elastic it's become as a term. It can be used to describe any kind of radical thought, right? And I think we might think about earlier moments in the last 20 years when critical race theory has also been used to suppress radical, like this is not a new thing. So when Lonnie Lanier gets unappointed by Bill Clinton and called a quota queen, it's also because she's imagined to be she was a critical race theorist, right, which was seen as dangerous and anti-democratic, and she didn't believe in one person, one vote, and she didn't believe in majority rule, right? Or even, I remember teaching my critical race theory grad seminar this semester when, this like secret video of Barack Obama standing next to Derek Bell came out, and it was like, you see this? He's Muslim, he's a communist, and he's a critical race theorist, like, right? So we get like critical race theory gets trotted out again and again as a way of silencing all different kinds of Black thought and condemning different kinds of Black thought that's seen as radical. I think for those of us who work in the university, then it opens up this question of like, how do we get to teach about race, right? Like, if the term critical race theory can mean anything and everything where we teach Black thought, and we know that those sites are vulnerable to policing, surveillance, faculty getting harassed, right? All of which happens with regularity. Then how do we teach our classes, and how do we signal to our students that we're going to teach these classes and that we value this kind of learning and want it to happen safely?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the language of some of the laws, which was really fascinating. And one of them said, if the things being taught make someone uncomfortable, then they could be banned. Thankfully, our governor, I believe, vetoed that very special idea. But I really desire for my students to be uncomfortable when I teach them. Like, if you are very comfortable and you are familiar with everything I'm talking about, then I'm not teaching. If I'm in any kind of class and I'm learning, my assumptions are being overturned. I figure out that, oh my gosh, I don't know anything about this, and so I'm worried about my own knowledge. So that struggle for learning is uncomfortable. If you put me down in a math class right now, I'm going to be deeply uncomfortable. No. And so that is what it is. And so the idea that we can police so that everybody feels cushioned, that no one's assumptions about the world they live in are overturned. I'm sorry, that's the work I do. That's what I'm called to do as a Black woman, a thinker, a scholar. I am called to tell you the stories that I didn't know when I started out. And so I'm going to keep doing that work. And I love that you called out this longer history. Speaking about Lonnie Lanier being attacked for ideas that are tremendously vital and important. We are not a majority country. I think we might be better off if we were in this moment when we have a Senate that does not represent the majority of the American people. By a scheme that they created a long time ago that doesn't work. So Lonnie Lanier was a person who was helping us think through other possibilities, other formations, other ways of thinking that might be liberatory to a whole number of people, not just Black people. So I think that discomfort, that overturning, that shaking things up is part of what we're called to do as educators. But it's good to remember that it will always try to get policed. It will always be a site of resistance. Perhaps we're doing something right if people are worried about that.
Yeah, and I want to say one of the things that I've been sitting with at UNC, which if you have followed over the last, 5-6 years, has had numerous, right, like instances of students who have studied, right, and have understand, right, the how structural racism manifests on that campus as a historical, right, as a historical fact, right, and in their kind of everyday lives on campus. And, that was, for me, my first day as an employee of the university was the day, my first day on campus as an employee of the university was the day after Silent Sam was felled, right? by the students and by folks in the community who believed, right, like this thing that seems to just be symbolic, right, really represents the inner workings of an institution that has systematically marginalized Black students, immigrant students, right, indigenous students throughout its history, right, as the oldest public institution in the country. And they have that understanding because they had, right, faculty who were teaching them things that are connected to critical race theory or adjacent, things about structures. They had study groups, they created zines, they created student organizations, they tried to rename buildings, right? And what we saw, right, like as, you know, the Trump administration, because this was, right, like a year into the Trump administration, what we saw was, right, an increasing presence, right, of right-wing neo-Confederate groups on campus threatening students' safety, right, and seeking to, right, suppress their ability to express themselves on that campus, right, and being aided and abetted and supported, right, by, or at least literally not prevented, right, by security officers on that campus, right? And so it, you know, these sort of panics, right, that have no factual basis, right, have these very real consequences, as we could say, on like the psyche of the students on these campuses, out in the world, right, and on the body, right? Like there were so many students that that just even at rallies, right, like described being assaulted by police, described being in confrontations, right, with these neo-Confederates that have ostensibly a right to be on that campus because it's a public space, right? And so, yeah, the danger, right, like the literal physical, right, visceral danger, right, of creating these sorts of panics that get read as everything in my life and that I understand is being threatened, so now I have to go off to war, right, against students or against folks who are trying to take down symbols of white supremacy, right, wherever they are. So yeah, that certainly, right, just in our kind of immediate backyard, right, has been a huge threat, right? I mean, there's a statue on the campus that's actually not far from where Silent Sam stood. And those of you who have been to UNC kind of know that's like a table that's supposed to be some memorial for Black folks, right? With Black folks sort of holding up this table, right? And it's like, it sits quite low, right, on the ground. It's hard to, you can't see it, right, like from the street. You have to walk up on it. And even just this summer, right, there had to be some intervention with neo-Confederates coming into that space and defacing that monument. So there's, those threats did not just stop, right, when the conversation stopped about Silent Sam because the pandemic hit, right? Because that's really what happened, right? And it's still picking up, right? It's still very present with us. So I want to, we have two other questions before we kind of turn it over to the audience. Is it a mistake to think of this moment just as a right-wing panic? I'm wondering who else benefits from this politically. Who else might want critical race theory to, I mean, not that it was like out there running around, right? But like, who else might benefit from the way that these right-wing pundits are talking about critical race theory?
I think that the energy, and I hate calling it critical race theory because it's just not, and it doesn't have anything to do with it, and the things that they are concerned about are not they're like concerned about teaching history, so
Right.
they're concerned about the diversity training. Okay. But I do think there's the energy of distraction that's at play, right? The ways in which people can be told in a moment of crisis for our entire country around a pandemic, an economic crisis that has been unveiled by a health crisis, that people are not making a living wage, and then you added on top of that an exposure of the inequality around health and the health gap and the wealth gap, and all of these things are at play. And people are opening their eyes to many of the things that activists and Black folks and brown folks and labor unions have been talking about for a very long time. And those things are tremendously amplified. And instead, people should not worry about that. They should worry about some lesson that your child got in school about slavery and whether or not they were comfortable. They shouldn't worry whether or not their insurance will cover the great costs that they're facing. They should instead think about some diversity training that happened somewhere. And it reminds me of the historical moments when segregation, Black voters, racial equality were the boogeymen of previous generations, designed to distract working class Black and white people from seeing the parallels in their own lives and seeing the ways in which the wealthy were disempowering them collectively, and using segregation, using lynching, using this totem about Black rule more than 100 years ago to distract those folks from thinking in more radical ways about what's possible for American people, what's possible for working people, what's possible as a basis for becoming organized. And so for me, I see it in the grand tradition of American distraction, that somehow abortion, what's in school, these are the things that are really threatening your daily household. Women's health and people teaching lessons in school are not our great crises right now. Those are things that we want to keep doing, that we want to do better, that we need to figure out how to do in this particular moment when we are so in jeopardy. And instead, you've been told to panic about this other. You've been told to worry about something that isn't really threatening anybody. That is just part of what we should all be striving to do, to learn about our past, to discover those things, to pass those lessons on to our children. So for me, it is that the power of distraction, that's the long tradition that's really at play. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And I also think there's this cultural anxiety that sort of got opened up with Trump about the university, right? So like increasingly the university is represented as this space that's like run by Black feminists where we indoctrinate students into radical thought, right? And you hear this again and again. Students come to places like Duke and they sign up for women's studies classes and Black studies classes and they come out Marxists, right? And those of us who work in the university realize that this is not at all what's actually happening, right? But this is again and again what gets represented, whether it's critical race theory or another question that you had, whether it's intersectionality, right? Which is another term that is imagined that, young, innocent 18-year-olds come to us and we fill their heads with these ideas about how power works and they go out into the world and vote Democrat, right? And so I think we could also think about how the anxieties about critical race theory actually allow us to think about these bigger anxieties about college, right? This huge political divide in this country around what the university.
And I think, the college piece is so right because when I was younger, to be a professor was an esteemed area. To be in a university setting meant you were an expert, that you were trained, and people respected it. And someone said, "Oh, this professor said this," then everyone, or a doctor said it was good. And then over the generations since I was born, there are more people of color, more black people who are in these professions, and suddenly there's some crisis. Suddenly there's some moment where the university has failed us, simply because there's a handful of people,
Literal handful.
literal handful of people who are in those spaces now, and so now those spaces don't have either, and now we have to rethink everything. So it really is a response to that one drop of inclusion that is so concerning for so many. That's a really great point.
So my last question, before we open it up, so this profession, speaking of like the academy, which is right where actual critical race theory, right, came from. It thrives when concepts and theories like that are coined in the academy become part of our public language, right, and our cultural understanding. And even, there's always misunderstandings, right, but that's like, a scholar's dream, right? To have a concept that captures some social reality that then the public takes up, right, as seeming to be true as a right analysis of our world. And so right now I'm thinking of like terms like intersectionality, right, which is about these matrices of oppression that have been taken up by any and everyone at this point, regardless of how well it's used. But the intentionality behind it is quite different, right, than like what's happening right now with critical race theory, right? And something that's like new word like misogynoir, right? The unique oppression of against black women in particular, right? So I'm wondering if you think there are some possibilities of this moment for critical race theory, right? Having been trotted out in this very false, right, and very disingenuous and dangerous manner, right? Is there an opportunity, right, for us, for those of us who actually understand what it means, right? For folks who are on the ground actually utilizing structural analysis of racism in their organizing to pivot. I mean, we are here right now, right? Like talking about what actually is critical race theory, right? Are there opportunities there that you see? I'll just leave it there.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I'm obsessed with intersectionality, right? This is what I've written about for some time. And I think it's fascinating that I now live in a world where students will come to my class and they already have heard this term. They've heard this term before they came to college. They might have heard it on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram. They'll cite people who are social media influencers, right? So I'll be like, what about Patricia Hill Collins? And they're like, what about Rachel Cargill? And I'm like, oh, that's very interesting, right? And I actually think that's a really fascinating moment.
Yeah.
What I think is an important intervention, though, is to say, oh, by the way, that's a term with a history, right? So while you might have discovered intersectionality on Instagram, like, let me tell you about Kimberly Crenshaw. And I feel the same way about critical race theory. So as people will use that term to describe any sort of theoretical or political work about race, I think it's really important to be like, have you heard about Eric Bell? Do you know about his speculative writing? Like, let me tell you, there's this term has a particular history, and you can use it as you like and have it move around as you see fit. But I think it is important to know that these terms have genealogies and histories. And also for a term like misogynoir, which often travels away from Moya Bailey, to be like, do you know that somebody came up with that term, right? And you can cite her, right? And that's actually really important too, to give credit to her intellectual labor, even as you might take that term and use it in lots of different contexts.
I do, I'm a person who the term respectability politics was very deeply used during Black Lives Matter, and I'm like, that's not what Evelyn meant. No, it's not. That's not.
Can you explain what respectability politics actually is?
So it was the idea that when Black women went into spaces, they created an accoutrement of respectability in order to begin to enter those spaces, so that people would begin to take them seriously. That they were well trained in the ways of the world around them, which was much more formalized, and so that their words could be heard. They learned that too, and so that they could more cleanly justify an exclusion or a silencing that didn't come from the way they dressed or the way they spoke, but simply because you just didn't like what they had to say. And in their world, that was a wedge. And so an Ida B. Wells or a Mary Church Terrell were not saying that regular Black people aren't respectable and I don't like them and they should be silenced. They were saying, I'm here to speak. So maybe more, Ida B. Wells was certainly speaking for the masses of women when she spoke as the child of enslaved people, as a woman who was an activist in many different segments, as a suffragist, as an anti-segregationist, as an anti-lynching activist. She was not always even capable of keeping her respectability together. She bit the hand of a conductor who tried to arrest her on a train. So, it didn't always work. She looked good, but she was ready to scrap. So the movement away from that, and the movement away from the understanding that, Rosa Parks and the people of that generation were quite radical, as much as they also tried to perform a respectability. Rosa Parks was a rape investigator, as I tell my daughter all the time. Don't forget that, Rosa Parks busted her. Rosa Parks, rape investigator in Alabama in the 1940s. So these are radical women. So as much as I was glad to see the term bandied about, it was bandied about in a way that made this generation say, well, we came up with this radicalism, and those generations were too stealthy to do the work. And it masked the ways in which they were revolutionary and would have been pushing us on questions, would have been pushing us to think much more deeply, even as they had, the elevator had that purse on her arm, right? Even as she had a little hat that she could perch on her head for that train ride. She was very much a person who implanted many of the ideas that we are using today. So yes and no, but coming to the classroom with language that you can then use as a conversation is really quite powerful. And I'm tremendously impressed. And part of why I stay active on social media is that this generation is always learning. That this generation is always teaching, is always seeking new ideas, and really calling the question. And they have no patience for any of the things that my generation tolerated and had to eat. And so I love that the conversation started, but I also want to make sure that we are honoring the radicality of our ancestors.
Thank you both. So I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, and maybe there's some questions from Crowdcast. Melisha?
Hi, my name is Melisha Burns, and I have a question. I think because, maybe perhaps because you women are in the academy, and you are very familiar with the history of critical race theory and that being an intellectual framework that's from the academy and best described to describe things, or best used to describe things in the academy. We had a lot of focus on critical race theory from there, but I think a lot of people are going to come into contact with anti-critical race theory sentiments kind of in the realm of public education and that K through 12, and I think Dr. Purifoy had touched on that a little bit, but I kind of want to get your thoughts on how that will manifest and how that is, I think probably, the white ring right-wing groups are probably using that as a method to attack public education and kind of the history of these attacks on public education, because I know that's not a new thing for right-wing groups to use education to further the separation and the degradation of certain groups. So if you guys can speak to that a little bit more in the ways in which most of us will probably come into contact with.
So I read on social media the other day that a black principal in Texas had been fired on the basis of him being a critical race theorist. He had some forum during the George Floyd protests and said some basic things and participated with a teacher-run event, and that was used as a basis, a very thin basis, to fire the first black male principal of this high school in Texas. And so, he was kind of incredulous. He's like, I'm not a critical race theorist. I participated in this event. I think I should be teaching and helping to guide our students in thinking about their world. And, these are the things that are affecting me, and, these are the things that are affecting the community. And so, it's devastating to see false, weird notions infect the careers that people have built, and the ways in which they want to seek to freely educate our children. Our country was supposed to be about the free exchange of ideas and free speech, and it's laying bare that those things don't apply equally, and can be turned off as no longer a principle of how people think about the world. So it's frightening and devastating to see that our children would grow up into a world that is even less preparing them about our history, our past, and leaving them less prepared to have frank conversations about the things we have to talk about and shouldn't be afraid to talk about.
Yeah, to add to that, speaking now as a parent and not as an academic, I can wear these two different hats. It feels like part of what's up for grabs is how is history narrated to our children, right? And I think of my own daughter who's 5, who's entered a world where she had one year where she walked into class and every kid's book in the room was written by a white author, right? And has entered a room this year where there's tons of books by authors of color, and it feels very different. And I think some parents feel a tremendous amount of excitement about that, and some feel a certain amount of anxiety about it. And up for grabs is how is her teacher going to narrate this, right? And so, and I think it's related to this question for critical race theorists about progress, right? Because the narrative that I was given growing up was once upon a time things were really bad, Rosa Parks sat on the bus and things got better, and Obama was elected, and here we are, right? That was essentially the narrative. And so what happens when public education becomes a space that ruptures that narrative? And I think it's about how children are educated, and it's also about how their parents feel about that education, right? Because I think to your point about discomfort, what happens when the narratives that kids are presented, whether they're 5 or they're 15 or they're 25, is not this sort of happy story of things got better, but a story that's far more complicated, and that's about complicity, right? That becomes really messy for parents, kids, and teachers to navigate. So I think to echo what you're saying about how much of what's at stake is this question of what happens in the classroom.
Just to add to that, in terms of the mother category, one of my favorite things is thinking back to when my oldest figured out that Martin Luther King was assassinated, because she just thought he had died of old age, because they never bothered to say that he had been cut down like that. Right. And so she was like, oh my God. But, every year we had talked about Martin Luther King. We had, done a food drive. And every year she really thought that, Martin Luther King was, very nice and in charge of, charity giving. And didn't have a sense from school of that history. And so, it's really me well, let's read this book too. And, let's talk about this. And let's talk about why someone would be so angry at these ideas. That we have to prepare, that particularly Black parents have to prepare our children to think about a world that doesn't like them. That my son was watching TV and looking at the bridge out west where all the people were laying down on the ground in protest of Derek Chauvin, and he was like, well, what are they upset about? And then the George Floyd footage played again and again, and he said, well, are they going to get up? And I have to teach him about the violence. I have to teach him about that world. I have to teach him those things. And so for school to just sort of tap out of discomfort, my kids are uncomfortable. My kids are always going to be uncomfortable. Shouldn't other kids have to learn a little bit of it? At least it wouldn't be that personal. It would be at this historical distance. But for my children, there is no historical distance that I can provide for them when it comes to these questions.
Yeah, and one thing I'm not a parent, but one of the things that I think about when I think about K through 12 education is, what's at the core of this, right, is this threat to whiteness and this immense desirability to not share power, right? White folks don't want to share power, right, in this country, and it's really clear through these kinds of panics, and they will manufacture any kind of crisis distraction, right, to avoid sharing power. And one of the ways that you can really groom, I would say, right, future generations to not demand power, right, is to teach them, right, that this country was great, and let me tell you how it happened, right? And so it's really, it's so deeply sinister, right, and so deeply dangerous. And as you say, right, like there is no distance, right, from history. Black children are watching these things happen in real time, and they know that something is wrong, right? And to walk into a classroom and to be told, let me tell you how this country was great and been great since before 1776, right, is intended to prepare them for a world where white people still rule. And so
the thing is that most white people don't have power. Most white people in this country don't have power. They don't have decent insurance. They don't have good education. They don't have access to fair-paying jobs. They are the majority of the people who are suffering under that boot. And so for me, it isn't really about, there's a handful of people who have power. There's really like a literal handful of people who have power. And so what's pernicious about this moment is that, what's revelatory about what I teach is what my white students start to understand about the world they live in. What allows them to see the ways in which their ancestors were sharecroppers and Black ancestors were sharecroppers, and they were a little tiny bit ahead because they were white, but not really. And really the person who owned the land and who ran the county was the one who ended up with power. And so, yes, the government ended up providing them with a bit of a means to get ahead, but it's not, by stepping on the necks of Black men and women and people in those moments, they were standing in that ditch that Dr. King talked about. That West Virginia is holding up Joe Manchin right now is the poorest state in the union with the most mineral-rich ground underneath their feet. And people die of disease taking other people's wealth out of that land. So it's, for me, it is that grand distraction that is so awful and so devastating. Because what is revolutionary about what happened in the moment of George Floyd was that those were white people on that bridge. Those were white young people who were like, yeah, I heard that on TikTok too. And I'm listening to my Black peers, and I am learning from Black scholars, and I am taking that in too. And that was what was really scary. Because if you really teach teach the truth, they don't come out on top.
Right. No, I think you're right about, like, you know, some of the material conditions and that sort of, but the upholding of the whiteness, right? Of the little bit ahead, the thing that you can grasp onto, right? I think is really what's critical and what feels at stake. So just speaking as somebody who's been involved in the police abolition movement in Durham for the past 5 years, we saw a massive increase in white folks, right, in this movement over the past year, and like a huge absence of them just within 1 year, right? And so like those things come in ebbs and flows, and I think you're right? Like people can start to see, right, like how, oh, well, like there is some alignment, right? Like I'm not on top, right? But I do think that there's, I do think that holding over of racial power, like however flimsy it may seem, is powerful enough to pull people out of movements, right? It's powerful enough to make movements die, right? And that still persists, right? And like that's, for me, like why we're, like a huge part of why we're still here, right? Still having these fights, right? Yeah, those realities are there.
It's important to remember that that's a lie. That, you know, the sense that they have some connection, some real things, like if they just, you know, work a little harder, they're about to be, you know, Jeff Bezos or whatever. No. And so, you know, that, you know, if you work a little harder, maybe you're going to eventually buy that slave, right? So that's the same cool lie that has been running for generations. That the families that own people and held them in bondage are still the same families who are wealthy and powerful today. That intergenerational wealth that really, you know, that no one is going to work hard. You can't work hard and become wealthy in this country. You can only inherit wealth, and you can only let other people build your wealth for you. You can only own it. And so the ways in which we see the folks who were slumlords in Durham in the 1950s are still the slumlords. Their children are the slumlords of today who own the places where black people live. It's the same people. And so, you know, you're not going to save it up and jump in that market. And, you know, but that's the lie that we keep telling people. That the lie that Obamacare is not going to help you. And people vote against health care in their own communities, that they're dying in those communities. That's what's powerful. That's why we're scary as a people, because we have been trying to educate our way out of this quandary for a really long time.
Yeah, I think the illusion is really, and the fantasy is very powerful, and it definitely sustains us in this structure. Do other folks have questions from the audience? Yeah.
I'm a first year adjunct instructor, and I noticed that you all have academic backgrounds. I was just wondering how you advocate for yourself in the academic sphere, how you, especially when you were starting out, how you advocated for yourselves.
I don't know. I'm a first generation academic. Most of the people in my family were working class. My mother, had a college degree. My father did not. My husband just recently got his college degree. I'm very excited about it. So, I'm not from something, and so I never knew what I was doing, to become anything. I, had to ask people for their CVs and try to figure out what was different about a CV and a resume. And, no one was really guiding the way. And part of why I mentor and part of why I serve as an administrator now is because I think it's so important to be transparent about the ways in which you might be fortunate enough to find a space for inclusion in the academy. But it's really hard to mentor our way or guide our way through what would actually make those spaces in which we work equitable in any real sense of the word, where we would live in a state where the campus population of professors would be reflective of the population of the state, which would be a beginning marker for me. So, I'm thrilled that I get to mentor young Black scholars, older Black scholars in what I do. I have 6 now Black women PhD students, which is a thrill to me. But, you know, it is a powerful and hard thing to think about the world that I'm guiding them into, that we have not been able to fundamentally change the structures that make their work doubly or triply difficult than their peers. But, you know, I'm open to mentor. If you look
Okay.
That's my calling.
All right.
On top of writing. So, where are you?
I'm a Central.
Oh, wonderful. Equal pride.
I would say, I mean, academia is such an insider business. So like, there's this awesome book Matt Brin wrote called Core Queer Studies. He came to my class to visit, and he had these amazing statistics on how many folks who are PhD students have parents who are academics. Like when you look at that, he was basically like, academia is a family business, right? And so there are some people who just know how everything works, right? What a CV is, right? How the job market works. They know because they can ask their parents or their parents' friends. And then there are the rest of us who don't know, right? And so I think just to echo that, how important mentoring is and how important it is to have frank conversation with mentors about the things that academics don't like to talk about, like money. Like we do not like to talk about, like like moving, right? Like this idea that you're just supposed to pick up and go to North Dakota. Right? Like you need to have someone in your life with whom you can have frank conversations about those questions, because that's the stuff that day to day, at least for me, has really mattered, right? Like, do I have enough money to survive the summer as a grad student, right? Like, so I echo, I'm always happy to talk. Feel free to, we can talk afterwards or email or whatever.
Yeah, just to point that out, that most of the people that I went to graduate school were actually the people that we were talking about. Like, they had trust funds, their families were intergenerationally wealthy, they didn't ever worry about the size of the stipend. I had a job before classes started. I had like 3 jobs at most points throughout graduate school, and it wasn't supposed to look like that. And I would get scolded because, you shouldn't be working, you should be working. I'm like, well, shouldn't I not be eating? Right. So, it's just a really very insiders, it's for the wealthy to have something to do and to think about because they don't really have to work. And that's how we build academia. And so that's why people don't make money and they travel and they have homes in Europe to go research in and get to the archive there. And so it's just a very different lifestyle if you need your check.
Yeah, that conversation really resonated with me because I was a former adjunct. And so, but I'm also wondering, the material conditions of adjuncts, the precarity that they're under is very different than tenured professors and tenured track professors. And oftentimes at institutions, those alliances aren't there because power is relational, right? So like how we were talking about that, it's not so much that every white person has the same amount of power, but in relation to Black people, they have a lot of power. Like the relationship of like not being enslaved is, very different than that, like your body, your flesh is made captive. And so what I'm wondering too is like thinking about that relational power. What do y'all think is, well, not only possible, but like maybe like what other forms of support have you seen that have been effective alliances in terms of tenure track professors, because even the levels of advocacy are very, very different. The pressures that adjunct instructors will also face in public institutions, teaching actual critical race theory or mentioning race will be very different than tenure track and tenure professors.
I think it's part of the same process that we were describing in terms of the devaluation of the university as a whole as it has become slightly more Black. We know that the ranks of those who are not on tenure track, who are serving as adjuncts in systems, it's interesting because in the North Carolina system, you don't call people who are not on the tenure track adjunct. They have come up with another
Part-time instructor.
They call them professional track.
Well, I mean, I've been an adjunct. I was called a part-time instructor.
Yeah. So they're euphemisms that have been adopted to sort of sometimes I think mask the disempowerment that folks are going through. And absolutely, the university profits from the devaluation of the way the market works, the way that there are now more people that they can pick and choose who they'd like to hire, and they've taken advantage of it. And it's a reminder of the systemic challenges that we are talking about. That it's not nearly enough that we are nice people, that we want to help others, but that the systemic structures that the university is built on are not fair, are not equitable. I would also point to graduate students who teach for below living wages in most universities around the country and are carrying teaching loads in the middle of a pandemic, facing a terrible set of choices as well. So there are profound inequities that the university continues to mask, and it's disheartening to see so many faculty who finally have some connection. They feel as though, I'm tenured, I've come over to the other side. It's also not easy over here, but I think it's important and imperative of all of us to think about layers and levels of inequity all around us that we are benefiting from now that we are given a little bit of money for travel and won't be fired at the end of the year.
Yeah, I would just add, of course, our university hides all of this from our students, right? So students, undergraduates, often report to me that they have no idea who's tenured, who's not tenured, who's a non-regular rank instructor, what an adjunct is, what that means, right? Like how the conditions of our labor are varied. And I remember one time with my first teaching job, I had a student who said to me, I really wanted to figure out who was tenured. So I went door to door in the women's studies department and thought there might be a special sticker or label on the tenured people's doors, and I couldn't find it, right? And I was like, oh, right, that's another thing that's completely opaque, right? And so I also think how we instruct our students, again, being frank about money, which I think is something academics don't like to do, but how we instruct our students in our classes. These are what our titles mean, right? This is what it means about salary, about benefits, about rank, about capacity to vote, and making that part of their education in our class is really important. And I think to your last point, I think we've talked a lot about radical Black thought, Black studies in the academy. We also, I teach at Duke, we enjoy a lot of power, right? I teach in a gender studies program that has quite a bit of power. We employ adjunct faculty, and we don't like to talk about the power that we have because we're invested in the narrative that we're disempowered and that we don't do bad things to other people, right? Because we're feminists, right? And so I think how we peel back the ugly truth that we are very much part of the university, that we inflict violence on people, including our adjuncts, is an important part of our own process as feminists.
For me, as we've had this conversation about Black women full professors, this summer, which I think was such an important and powerful conversation, which I think in part pushed me to put my name forward this year. So I'm not a full professor, but I hope to be one day. Soon. But for me, the important thing is not that I'm full and so that I'm good and now maybe I can make enough so that I'm making a better clip at my student loans, but instead that I am calling out inequalities, that I'm demanding a living wage for everyone that teaches at my university, that I am calling out the ways in which privileges live in the small policies that people can't see, that aren't visible, beyond the ones that are visible that we can see. So I am one simple administrator, and so can't therefore do much because it is this larger system. But I can certainly try to call the question and call the rules out and learn the code. I think that it is my duty to be the spook who sat behind the door and, at least share and make transparent the systems that I do know about and the things that I can, talk about. And so that's part of the mentorship that I share with my students and students and more vulnerable faculty all the time. But I know that's terribly insufficient.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I didn't want to
Yeah, let's talk.
overlook the folks on Crowdcast who have questions. So the one question from Wes and Paula Patrick asks, could the panelists give some examples of structural influences and perspectives and how these are different from and cannot be addressed/solved by diversity training? Does the normalization of brain damage in Black athletes constitute structural racism?
Like 4 questions.
Can you read it one more time? Just the first part.
Question from Wes and Paula Patrick. Could the panelists give examples of structural influences and perspectives and how these are different from and cannot be addressed/solved by diversity training? Does the normalization... We get on the first part?
Yeah.
Does the normalization of brain damage in Black athletes constitute structural racism?
Ooh. That's a question.
Okay, I'll take a stab at the first part. I'm going to give an example from the context of the university, right? So, one of the spaces. So I think one of the things that critical race theory teaches us is to think about how standards are articulated, and they're often articulated in neutral ways that mask all sorts of biases, right? And this happens a lot, I think, in academic circles when we're hiring. So we have people come to give job talks, we assess the job talks, and we say things like, did you think she was nice? Did she seem likable? What did you think? Do you think she'll move here? Do you think she's movable? I don't know if she's movable. And we say all of these things that are not about the scholar's work, right? Which is really the thing that we should be assessing, right? The scholar's work, their capacity to teach. We use these other terms that are often about race, about gender, about sexuality, about class, and about fit, which is that amorphous, slippery way that we basically say, we want to hire someone who's like us, right? We don't want to hire someone who's going to rock the boat, like will they fit in? And so we end up replicating the same, right? Which is why so often when you look at departmental websites, you have lots and lots of people who went to the same universities and were trained by the same scholars, right? And that's another thing that becomes a proxy for excellence. Oh, they went to X school. They must be great. And we also have the same advisor.
12 schools where 90% of all faculty in the country went to.
Right, right. And so I think that's a question that's about structure, right? That's never addressed by diversity trainings adequately, in my mind, right? Never. And yet it has this tremendous influence on who gets hired, promoted, tenured, who's in the classroom. So that's one example that comes to mind.
My former head used to call it good letterhead.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Okay, I was doing many things at once. Thank you. So the next question from Annette Rodriguez, who says, thank you all so very much. 3 exclamation points. How might we respond to the purposeful and weaponized misunderstanding of theoretical frameworks? How do we balance the need to press on historicizing and insisting on precision with the need to walk away, shake hands, and rest and dialogue with those dialoguing in good faith?
I'm going to badly paraphrase Toni Morrison about not doing other people's work, to keep doing your work. To be honest with you, this is my first engagement with the critical race theory. Some work for fluffle, in part because I'm doing work that I really value and I'm excited about, and I only have so much time because I am in my community, that I am a parent, that I am a spouse, that I am all those things, and so there's there's limited time, and if I always am running to the fire of someone else's false crisis, then we don't get to do our work. So part of being healthy and part of finding that balance is knowing that we are individuals who can only do so much. That we do them in the spaces that meet the principles that we value. So I came to this conversation at a Black-owned, queer-owned bookstore in the community I love and care about and have lived in since my early 20s because I care about this space and that this space is valuable to me, and this conversation with them and in support of them is valuable to me. So those were a set of particular choices I was making to say a quick yes because of that. And for other spaces it would be a no because there's only so much of me to go around. There's only so much of any of us to go around. As scholars of Black women scholars, we are asked to do unbelievable amounts of work. People are resentful when we don't say yes to all of their requests. And so I know these very formidable women up here with me have so many things that they are excellent at, that they could be talking about, that they could be doing, if not for attending to the crises in the communities around them, attending to crises on their campuses. It's an erosion of who we can be as scholars, as who we can be as mentors and teachers to our students about the particular things they're interested in. So we always have to be conscious of that quote. Toni Morrison is the most brilliant theorist I've ever met, just briefly that one time. And so, certainly the most formative theorist I had the chance to think about and learn from. And so that's a lesson that I hold close.
Is there another question, or do we?
There's one more.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to forget the podcast. I'm going to butcher your name. I'm so sorry, but I think it's Isa Eringer, and they're asking, how do we combat this culture of distraction and the ways in which mainstream media amplifies the controversies rather than debunking them? As y'all note, the reductive debate has nothing to do with actual CRT, but a buzzword exists and the controversy gets all the oxygen. What can we do to get the media to focus, to be able to reframe these public conversations so the right-wingers aren't always setting the terms of debate and endlessly advancing another boogeyman to distract us?
I honestly don't think that, we ever stop, right? That tide of things from happening. I do think that the intentionality of the work that we are doing in the world really matters, right? One of the, and this is going to be a shameless plug, for Scalawag magazine, which is a media organization that I was involved in edited for 5 years, that was really trying to take on narratives about the South, right? That weren't about white Southernness, right? That weren't about the lost cause, right? And really blowing up the myth, right, of objectivity in journalism, to talk about how each one of these media outlets that are the so-called standard bearers, right, of journalism has a perspective, right, has a bent that shapes how they report things, right? Fox News being one of the, clearly, right, where all of this started, one of the sort of more obvious examples. And so it's really about the work that we advance that is not just about pushing back against those narratives, but what are we creating, right? What are the kinds of institutions that we're creating? What are the kinds of curriculums that we are creating in our classrooms and those sorts of things that can really, right, serve as a counter without being about without centering, right, these folks, right? Because they're always going to do what they do, right? And so our work, to my mind, there is absolutely some resistance, right, that like has to be put forth, right? Because unfortunately, and I'm thinking particularly in our state, right, the folks who have the power of legislation, right? The folks who have power to shape kind of the policies that are structuring outcomes here are folks who are deeply in alignment with these folks, right? So there's resistance that's necessary always, right? But I think one of the things to keep our focus on is about what we're building in this moment. So I think this right here, right, what we're doing right now is a really good example. We're talking about something that, yes, came out of something that these folks, the boogeyman that these folks created, right? But we're also talking about things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis in our own worlds, right? That aren't about them, right? But also create other narratives and other possibilities. And I think that's what we can do and we should do a whole lot more of.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to say a quick thank you. It's 8 o'clock, so I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone for coming out and hanging with us. Coming out and hanging out with us. I really appreciate you taking the time. If we can please give our panelists and moderator. Yes, thank you for saying yes to us. As Dr. Kelly said, it's you and Danielle and Dr. Kelly have said we are 5 months here, I think, coming on to 5 months. It's a lot of hard work, and you get a lot of no's. And so it means the world to us when we get a yes, and especially when we get a yes the first time. Thank you all for believing in what we're trying to do. I'm really, really very grateful and thankful for your coming here and for the conversation that you brought to us. Thank you to the audience. Again, I really appreciate that. So that's it for tonight. We have another event October 15th. This will be a virtual event. We'll be launching a children's book written by Ann Winter. And it is, what's the word when people draw things? Illustrated, yes. My brain just went away. Illustrated by Olga Mora, who's worked with Carrie. Saturday, and there's another one. What's the other?
Thank you, Omi.
The oldest student. Thank you, Omi. Yes, thank you, Omi. Sorry, I always forget that one and it's your name. So that's October 15th. The virtual event, it's on our website, brookfieldbooks.com. Click on the events tab. If you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, if you all want to drink coffee at 8 o'clock, the bar is open. We also have tea, we have biscuit refreshers, so take your time, walk around.
There's wine and cheese.
And there's wine and cheese. If you're feeling wine and cheese, we have red and white wine. So thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was really good back in the day. Right.
I want to say thank you. It was like